Welcome to another Signal Conversation. My guest today is Dr. Mahzarin Banaji. Dr. Banaji is an award-winning experimental psychologist and professor at the Department of Psychology at Harvard. Her research explores the human mind, why and how we think and feel, especially in social contexts. She's helped create world-renowned frameworks to better identify and address implicit human biases. And she's the co-creator of the Implicit Association Test, which has been used over 40 million times around the world. She's also the author of a must-read book titled Blind Spot: The Hidden Biases of Good People. We're going to be having a conversation in two segments, so Dr. Banaji, let's get into it. First off, can you explain what implicit bias is and how it presents in business?
Sure. It's best to think of an implicit bias as an attitude or a belief that we have that will affect our understanding of the world. It will affect our decisions in the world, but without our realization. So when we think about implicit biases, we can think about them as these attitudes or stereotypes that we might have about groups as a whole, and how those thoughts and feelings get into our judgments about individual members of that group. You see it everywhere. You can focus on any aspect of the workplace, any nook and cranny. How do we write an ad? Where do we recruit? Who do we hire? How do we promote? And who do we tap for succession? In each of these processes, we can see that there are systematic effects of a person's group membership that are entering into our decisions about individuals. And that's what we call implicit bias.
And you've called it sort of the thumbprint, if you will, of our culture on our brains. And that sort of implies, and the way you just described it makes me think, there's one way we think about ourselves consciously, but there's a way that we act that is according to some rules that we're not necessarily aware of. Can you unpack that a little bit for us?
So, we understand the concept of bias as discrimination that is built into or baked into a system, such that no one of us has to actively harm anybody, but the harms and the benefits in our society are part of a system that will continue to do its work, producing, generation after generation of unequal outcomes. To understand how this happens, we've been using this metaphor of the thumbprint of the culture to understand where it's coming from. When I'm born as an infant, I'm not born with these biases. I do not know that as I grow up, in my mind, Black will come to be associated with bad and white with good, or, male with strong and female with weak, and so on. I don't know that, but I learn it awfully fast. The word thumbprint is used to really stress the idea that it is leaving a mark, that it is not something you might feel that when you drive from home to work, you just drove from home to work. But that's not all you did. You looked at billboards and you saw certain kinds of people doing certain kinds of work. Each and every little minute of your interaction in the world or your experience is giving you all of that information. And that we refer to as the thumbprint of the culture on our brain.
Can you give me an example or two of how this thumbprint shows up, particularly, say, in the workplace?
Yeah, I think let's do that. Where shall we start is the question. So for a moment, just to give you a very clear example, let's just set aside categories in which I'm interested. Categories like race, gender, ethnicity, sexuality, these heavy topics that provoke argument and differences of opinion. Let's take something that is completely innocuous, okay? The distance between a person's eyes, whether their mouth tilts a little bit down or not. It turns out that our minds look at these features on a person's face and incorrectly use them to make decisions about how smart is that person, how trustworthy is that person. So this is the work of a wonderful psychologist by the name of Alex Todorov. I call him the mathematician of the human face because he has demonstrated to us that simple things like, millimeter differences between a person's eyes will lead the perceiver to think that they're either smarter or less smart, trustworthy or not so trustworthy, little things like that. Now, we know from the science that the distance between our eyes is absolutely not in any way a marker of our competence. But you will be astonished when you actually visit his site and you look at these images, and you can see that when you see a person with eyes that are a little closer to each other, we'll immediately begin to feel like this person is not as smart. Now, we may not realize this on our own until an experimenter points it out. But that's a very simple example of how a feature of the face that should not be signaling anything to us actually does. And we're using that in our decisions and our judgments.
That's fascinating. Now, I do want to come back to the topic you set aside because it is so much in everybody's mind. We've had a very tumultuous year in the United States, and your work certainly has been thrown front and center after the events of summer of last year in 2020 with the murder of George Floyd. And I think perhaps people think that this implicit bias and bias conversation is essentially a United States conversation. But as I understand it, your work has shown that this is not specific to just the United States. What is unique to the United States in your experience, and what is unique to everybody?
What is unique to the United States is that we are having the conversation earlier and faster. But it is a problem that you can see worldwide. What I study is not something that is true of certain minds in certain places. This is true of human beings. It is how the system got built through evolution to be what it is. So it is in every mind, okay? It's like asking somebody, do you have any preferences at all? I mean, we are bundles of preferences, right? We prefer chocolate over strawberry, and like that, we prefer categories of people, one over the other. It's just that in the case of chocolate and strawberry, I'm willing to tell you that it's chocolate or strawberry that I like. It's impossible for me to know when it comes to looking at two candidates that I'm actually being driven by the fact that one of them may have attended the same high school I did or whatever. So those are the kinds of biases we're talking about. So this is true everywhere in the world. However, the exact bias absolutely cannot be the same everywhere because cultures vary. Okay? Certain ones might. So age bias, everywhere we go, we can see gender and age. But race, as in the United States, is uniquely the US. If you go to Brazil, that notion of race is going to make no sense at all. In fact, something else might make a lot of sense, and that is fine deviations in skin tone in Brazil, for example. So each culture will present to us certain aspects of their history and their culture that make it important for us to study them. I was born and raised in India. It would be very important if I wanted to understand India, for example, for me to look at attitudes between Hindus and Muslims, which is not something that we would be thinking about every day here, right? Or about people of upper castes and lower castes and so on. So what I'm saying here is twofold. Everybody has them, every culture has them, but the specific ones are absolutely going to vary by culture.
Well, thank you. Now, in the next segment, we are going to discuss what we've learned and what we can do going forward with that knowledge. So stick around for the second part of this conversation with Dr. Banaji.